So the next thing is like cascading rollback, right? So let me show you the example so that you will be able to visualize, right? So you have a pair of concurrent transactions, T8, T9, and T10. So transaction T8 writes a value of data item capital A that is being read by transaction T9, and transaction T9 writes a value of data item capital A that is being read by transaction T10, right? So over a period of time, transaction T8 gets aborted, right? So what should you do? You should undo the effects of the transaction T8. And since transaction T9 is dependent on transaction T8, we have to undo the transaction T9. And since again transaction T10 is dependent on transaction T9, we should undo the transaction T10, right? So like a single failure of a transaction leads to a cascading rollback of a pair of transactions that are dependent on the particular transaction. It's known as cascading rollback, right? So consider the partial schedule in figure 14.15 in your textbook. So this is the partial schedule, schedule 10. So transaction T8 writes a value of data item capital A that is being read by transaction T9, right? So transaction T8 writes a value of data item capital A that is being read by transaction T9. Again, transaction T9 writes a value of data item capital A that is being read by transaction T10, right? So transaction T9 writes a value of data item capital A that is being read by transaction T10. So suppose at this point transaction T8 fails, right? So transaction T8 fails, it has to be aborted, right? So what should you do? Since T9 is dependent on T8, T9 must be rolled back. It should be aborted and it should be rolled back. And since T10 is dependent on T9, it should again be rolled back, right? So this phenomena in which a single transaction failure leads to a series of transaction rollback is called as cascading rollback, right? So this is known as cascading rollback, right? So it occurs because you have multiple concurrent transactions, and each transaction is going to read the value of data item that is being written by another transaction, right? So you have a group of transactions T8, T9, T10. T8 writes a value of data item capital A that is being read by transaction T9. T9 writes a value of data item capital A that is being read by transaction T1. So at one point of time, transaction T8 cannot proceed, and it has to be aborted, and the transaction T8 has to be rolled back, right? So since transaction T9 is dependent on transaction T8, it has to be rolled back, and transaction T10 is dependent on transaction T9, and it has to be again rolled back, and so on. So a single transaction failure in this case has lead to a series of rollbacks. It's known as cascading rollback, right? So this phenomena in which a single transaction failure leads to a series of transaction rollbacks is called as cascading rollback.